Good evening. Welcome to all of you. My name is Ron Stern. I'm one of the rabbis here at Stephen Wise, and as I stand up here and look out on you, it seems like a great opportunity for Shabbat services. So if you don't mind, thought we'd do a quick service and then we can go on. No, actually, we're just very happy to be able to partner with the Center Theater Group to offer this program in this end of the city. I discovered that the Center Theater Group and Stephen Wise have been around for about the same time, half a decade. So it's finally wonderful that we've found a way for our paths to cross and to be able to present what I trust will be a fascinating exploration of the play Indecent. Couple of things. We just want to thank, first of all, Center Theater Group board member Glenn Sonnenberg, also a past president of Stephen Wise Temple, who brought all of us together. So we're grateful to him, as well as Ed Namias, who has been on our executive board and is the supporter both of the theater group and Stephen Wise. So there are a lot of symbiotic things going on here, which is a wonderful thing. It's a pleasure to welcome Paula Vogel. She actually was involved in an interview with our senior rabbi here, Rabbi Yoshi Zweibach, for his podcast about an hour and a half ago. He walked out of there and he said, "She's unbelievable." So I think we are absolutely in for a treat. And if you can get your hands on the podcast, I invite you to listen to it. So let's get the evening started. I'd like to turn the microphone over to Doug Baker, who is the producing director for Center Theater Group. And once again, thank you for being here.
Thank you, sir. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And thank you, Rabbi Ron. It's my pleasure and honor to be here and to be in this most beautiful temple. Center Theater Group is proud to be producing Indecent. I want to make sure I give you the dates so you have them. From June 5, in fact, we start Wednesday night, this Wednesday, through July 7 at the Amundsen Theater. This one is at the Amundsen, at the Music Center, of course, in downtown. For those that don't know CTG, but I suspect most here do know CTG, fortunately, we produce and present shows at the Amundsen, the Mark Taper Forum, and the Kirk Douglas Theater here in LA. And often we have the opportunity to bring spectacular plays and musicals, not only from Broadway, but to Broadway. Indeed, I want to echo what Rabbi Ron said. A special thanks to Glenn Sonnenberg, who really made this all possible for us, Ed Namias, and Betsy Borns, who are not only CTG board members, but as you know, members of your community here. Our production of Indecent reassembles the team from the 2017 Broadway production of the show. This is a spectacular production. We happen to be producing this show. This is not a tour. This is specially made for all of us here. We are producing this show with our friends at the Huntington Theater Company in Boston. And in fact, that production just wrapped. We rehearsed it in New York. We pooled our resources, agreed that it would go to Boston first and then come to us. In fact, one of our cast members is here this evening. Harry Groner is here. Where did Harry move to? Harry, where are you? There he is. He's right back there. Harry Groner. Harry is one of our newbies in the company. A little bit more than half of the cast members performed the play on Broadway in 2017. Harry did not. He has joined the group and is a terrific addition to the company. So thank you for being here tonight, Harry. Indecent is written by Pulitzer Prize winner Paula Vogel. Paula, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. Indecent follows the incredible true journey of a groundbreaking piece of theater, Sholem Asch's God of Vengeance, and the passionate artists who literally risked their lives to perform it. Winner of the 2017 Tony Award for Best Director, Rebecca Teichman, and nominated for Best Play, Indecent is a celebration of art, a fierce indictment of censorship, and a gripping look at an explosive moment in theatrical history. Along with many of my CTG colleagues, I was fortunate to see the Broadway production. and immediately knew that we had to find a way to bring this production to Los Angeles. And so I'm so pleased that we've been able to do that. It is engaging, it is surprising, and ultimately extremely powerful. We're thrilled you can join us tonight, and again, thank you. This is a very special conversation I think we're going to have tonight, and I'll get off the stage very soon, but first I want to talk a little bit about our moderator. Our moderator tonight is Deborah Piver. Deb is a resident teaching artist at Center Theater Group, focusing on engagement, learning, and connection through Center Theater Group's audience talks and our amazing student matinees. Deb previously served as the Associate Director of our Education and Community Partnerships Department. Before coming to CTG, Deb served as the Director of Education for Cornerstone Theater Company, a local Los Angeles company, and Literature to Life. She has taught at California State University, Los Angeles, Northridge, Cal Poly Pomona, USC's School of Theater, USC's Medical School. I want to hear about that sometime, Deb, medical school. And as an artist in residence in both New York and Los Angeles public schools. Again, thank you for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Deb Piver.
Come up, and then I'll unmute you. Sure. Okay. We're all going to make our entrance now, and then I'll introduce the panel. Come on up and get comfortable. Okay. It is such an incredible pleasure and honor to be here, and I cannot wait to dive into this conversation. So I'm going to introduce our panel in a moment. I'm going to give you a little context of the conversation, and then we're going to dive in. It's going to be a big one. It's going to be, I don't know, I can't wait. And because I wasn't responsible for making the play, I get to just gush. This play just moves my heart, Paula's Indecent, and it just fills me, and I can't wait for you to learn about it tonight and then get to see it. So our conversation, we'll have a conversation for about 40 minutes with the panel, and then we'll open it up to questions from you all for them. And the purpose is really to dive in to God of Vengeance, which is the play that inspired Paula Vogel's Indecent. And in that, Doug mentioned some of the things: censorship, art, passion. Everything we're going to talk about, we could talk about that one thing for the whole conversation, but we're going to dive into all of them. And I want to start to frame the conversation with a quote from Paula that she gave me permission to read, because I think it really frames why we're here so beautifully, and then I'll introduce our beautiful panel. So Paula said, "If we love music and theater and the arts, if we take solace in people sitting beside us in the theater, if we do what is in our hearts, I think there is light for us. I think the power of us being together in community gives us light through the darkness. I think the power of art is a way for us to change our worldview. I think art is our spiritual bread that we break together." So this conversation is the start of breaking bread together, and I can't think of a better place to break spiritual bread than this beautiful, beautiful sanctuary. So thank you for having us, and let me introduce the panel. And I'm just going to share a couple of highlights, because again, we could just do their bios, and that would take us for the 40 minutes, because they've all done such amazing work. So I'll give a few highlights and then let them share a little bit more about their work, and then we'll dive into the two plays. So Paula Vogel is a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright whose plays include Indecent, How I Learned to Drive, The Long Christmas Ride Home, The Baltimore Waltz, Hot and Throbbing, and A Civil War Christmas. She has more awards than can be listed, but you have them on your little program there. But I'll mention a few: the American Theater Hall of Fame Award, an Obie Award, New York Drama Critics Award, and she is honored to have 3 awards in her name for emerging playwrights. She is a passionate playwright and a passionate educator, and she teaches playwriting workshops throughout the United States and abroad. Miri Corral has a passion for Yiddish. There's a lot of passion. I think that's going to be a theme here tonight, which she's been exercising for over 20 years as an educator, translator, bilingual writer, and dialect coach. She is a continuing lecturer in Yiddish at UCLA, where she teaches language, literature, and film, and she is the founding director of the California Institute for Yiddish Culture and Language, and a native Yiddish speaker. So I can't wait to learn more about your work and share that with our audience. Shane Baker is the director of the Congress for Jewish Culture, and the New York Times called him one of the most prominent proponents of Yiddish theater, language, and culture in New York. He has translated God of Vengeance into English and played Yankel in Yiddish in God of Vengeance in 2 off-Broadway runs. And that's the father. You'll learn more about the play in a little bit. He's also performed in his own Yiddish translation of Beckett's Waiting for Godot. And so, yes, there's a lot of, just really, so will you just join me in just a round of applause for this panel. And before we dive into the 2 plays, I would love for you each just to say hello to the audience and share either a little bit more about the work you're doing right now, or kind of the initial spark that got you into what you're doing. Anyone want to start us off? Or pass it down, right?
Well, I'm going to tell you what a thrilling day it was for me yesterday. I'm very honored to be the first Hearst Professor of Playwriting at UCLA. So I've worked, thank you. It's been an honor to join my colleagues in theater, and I've had several workshops in January with these extraordinary young writers. We've done more workshops on this visit, but yesterday, both worlds I got to combine, and I just said to I shouldn't call them kids, I just said to these young adults, we're doing the 10 out of 12 tech day, where we start at 10 and we leave at 10. It's open to you. Thanks to Center Theater Group, you can just come in, you can sit, you can go back to all the hiding spaces, whatever you want. And they came and they joined our community for 6 hours.
Wow.
And to see the generosity of the actors and the designers and the technicians, the choreographers, everyone just talking with them and sharing them. I thought they were going to be in the door, half an hour later, go see ya. But they stayed with us all night. So that's been a thrill. And that's brought both worlds together.
Beautiful.
I live in New York, if you call that living. And I happened to be in town because Mary had arranged for me to perform what I believe is the only Yiddish language drag act going down at the Central Library yesterday. So that's how I happened to be here.
Missed it.
Thank you.
So aside from producing that program that Shane got to star in, I also, I don't know if you mentioned, I also teach Yiddish at UCLA, where I've been for the last 20 years. I have taught at AJU across the street as well to adults. It's my second career, actually, because my first career was environmental planning. For a long time. In fact, if you know Playa Vista, I coordinated half of that environmental report for that project. But I figured, endangered species, endangered languages, why not? This one happens to be mine. So it was an interesting and actually effortless transition to being one of the champions of Yiddish.
Wonderful. And we're going to talk more about the language and the culture itself. But let's start with God of Vengeance and Indecent, these 2 plays that are connected. And Paula's Indecent begins with the character Lemel describing God of Vengeance, saying, "We have a story we want to tell you about a play that changed my life." And I would love to know about, and share with the audience, a little bit more about God of Vengeance, when it was written, why, and some of that history, and then we'll move into how that inspired you, Paula. You're looking at
Well,
Shane.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
extraordinary to me because I'm sitting next to a man that I got to see perform this in Yiddish.
Yeah.
So I am, and looking at both of you.
Yeah.
I have only read the play in English. I read an out-of-print copy of the 1912 translation, and I read it as a graduate student. My professor looked at me and said, "There's a play you need to read." I had no idea why. He said, I want you to read it now, God of Vengeance. So I raced to the library, and I read the first act, which is a really kind of interesting, I almost want to describe it like a Gorky-esque, right, early Ibsen kind of play that takes place in a brothel owner's home, where he is trying to buy his daughter's way into a better society with the money from his downstairs business, the brothel ring. Okay, that's the first act, which isn't a bad read, I got to tell you. I think I was 23 when I was reading it. And then I got to the second act. And as I recall it, and this is a motif in the play, I stopped breathing. There is a scene between the prostitute downstairs and the daughter, the virgin daughter of the brothel owner. And it is a love scene that to this day, I'm 67, I don't think I've read a more exquisite love scene between two women. So completely unprepared for, out of the blue, and as I was reading the love scene, I kept talking to the play. This was produced in 1907? A young man wrote this, a young newlywed man wrote this. You know, it's one of the reasons that I also like seeing God of Vengeance in this moment of time is I know that we think we've invented everything. So it's particularly wonderful with younger students in this moment of time and celebration of multiple sexualities to realize that this play was going all around Europe as a celebration. And then the third act ends very tragically. Stop me if this is the wrong plot summary, but basically the young daughter runs away with the prostitute Manka, and it is discovered by the parents as the fiancé is due to arrive that the daughter is missing.
The bought fiancé.
The bought fiancé, that's right. And one of the things that's really extraordinary at the time and quite scandalous is that Yankel has had a Torah scribed for his daughter's bedroom to keep her pure. And this is part of her dowry. So it ends with the father losing his mind, thinking that this was going to be his new start. This was going to be his way of making everything right with God, and his daughter has eloped, and he suspects that she's become a prostitute in this new house that Manka wants to open. And it ends with him telling the truth to the fiancé, the rabbi, sending them away, breaking off the marriage, and then hurling his wife and daughter down into the brothel to pay him back. And it ends with him lifting the Torah saying, and take the holy scroll, I don't need it anymore, and position himself as if to throw it into the brothel. Okay, you can imagine how this must have gone over, or I like to imagine how this went over in the first reading in 1907. Would that be an accurate description of it?
Pretty good. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I
So-
think you know it quite well. Yes.
Good. It's actually one of the things that I don't know that do you hear this? When I ask people, please read The God of Vengeance, or one of the things that's thrilling, when Rebecca Teichman and I started working on Indecent, we said we wanted it to be product placement for The God of Vengeance. Because when you read The God of Vengeance, it very much holds its own, and it is like an early Ibsen or an early Gorky. I mean, all of those plays that I read and loved. But the thing that young people come back to me when they read it and they say with astonishment, it feels like it was written today. This is so contemporary in the way that it looks at women, at the policing of desire, that and the violence against women. So that's where it started. For me, was reading the play. And
Yeah.
where did you guys start with it?
You know, I'm probably one of the few people in this room, in this wonderful space, who actually attended Yiddish theater in its heyday. Is that true? Is anyone else out there who did? Hey, so that makes 2 of us, 3 of us, maybe 4 of us. Okay. I was a child who was dragged to the Yiddish theater by my parents, every new production we went to. And anyway, God of Vengeance was in there somewhere. So I was aware of it all my life in different guises. Even in Vilnius in 2003, it was performed by a Romanian company, not in Yiddish and Romanian. It was really odd. I didn't like the play because every time I'd seen it performed, it seemed to hit only one note, which was really all about the scandal and the hypocrisy. And something was missing for me. It seemed to have missed the point of Sholem Asch, who is all about complexity and compassion for human foibles. And then, a few years ago, I saw the Yiddish production in which Shane appeared, playing the hypocritical brothel owner father. And that was it. I got the play. And I understood how multi-layered it was and how wonderful it was. And so we actually had it performed as a reading. Some of you were there at, rival Wilshire Boulevard Temple, just a couple of months ago. We used Shane's translation because he knew the play so well. And knew how it would work with actors today, with languaging that would work for today. It was just a dramatic reading with Theodor Dybbuk, who did it for us. But why I'm mentioning this, because the response from the audience was what was amazing. I had seated the audience with some of my students from UCLA, so it brought the average age down a bit. So that was nice. But all of them really felt that it was timely, that this play from 1907 was still speaking to them, and that it was painful for them to experience because of the violence or the threat of violence that is prevalent in this play, toward women, of course. Yeah.
Will you share, your experience?
Sure. My introduction to the play was via, close work on it was via a friend, Carrot O'Brien, who's a fine translator, actress, writer, who had made a translation back in the 90s. I think she had some contact with Rebecca at a certain point.
Yes.
And it inspired her to translate it.
Yeah.
And it was put up, you recall the plot line of the brothel downstairs and the kosher family upstairs. Important. Her partner, Aaron Bell of Toto Connada, had just acquired Show World, a porn palace at 42nd and 8th, thanks to Rudy Giuliani's obscenity laws in New York. They kept the porn downstairs and they gave us a theater upstairs.
Wow.
This is a sensational moment of American theater history.
So we made that space kosher by playing this play upstairs with a brass pole in the middle of the stage. This was the transsexual room, or tranny room, as it was known then, because things have changed in 20 years. So we played that there, and on Sunday afternoons, there's some talk about loss of Yiddish. We like to think there's continuity, but there is certainly a loss of a generation of those native Eastern European Yiddish speakers. And those last of the Mohicans would come in on Sunday afternoons in their fur coats, white gloves, blue hair, maybe a walker, maybe a cane, through Show World, upstairs to see this show. And it was a remarkable experience, to say the least. Yeah. So that was my introduction to it.
Fantastic, thank you. And then Paula, so you shared your first impression of it and your first encounter with God of Vengeance, and then how did it spark, and what was the journey to create Indecent from there?
The journey to create Indecent, it's interesting. I had heard of this director, Rebecca Teichman, because as her thesis project as a director at Yale School of Drama, she staged the obscenity trial. She kind of cut it down to, it's thousands of pages long. And I read every page. So she somehow managed, in a kind of way like Gross Indecency presents the trial of Oscar Wilde, presented the trial of God of Vengeance. And I kept thinking, who is this woman? I've got to meet this woman. Flash forward another 10 years, out of the blue, I get a phone call. And it's Rebecca saying, I know this is really it's improbable, but the artistic director of Oregon Shakespeare Festival, Bill Rausch, yes. And I are sitting here, and we're wondering if you might be interested in writing a play about the obscenity trial of God of Vengeance. Now, I describe this moment as when people who love Star Trek, when two Trekkies find each other, in a crowded hotel, and we immediately found each other. And as we were talking, this thing happens, and if it happens to me as a writer, all the writers in the room, I hope you've experienced this, and I'm not the only crazy person in this room, but you suddenly see something. You see a scene happening. You see characters. And as we talked, I saw a troupe in a dusty attic, and somehow I knew it was Poland. I figured it would probably be Loach, and then I did the research to find the troupe. And they were about to perform God of Vengeance. So I said to Rebecca, I think it's more than the obscenity trial, which is interesting. I did do several drafts of just the obscenity trial. And
will you actually, because not everyone may know about the obscenity trial in the history of this play.
So here's another way to pitch God of Vengeance, all right? Traveled all over the world in Yiddish. It was kind of great critical success. Came to the United States, was performed downtown in Yiddish, places like the Bowery Theater. Amazing actors coming and doing the role of Yankel. And then someone got the bright idea, what if we translated it into English? So it went uptown, as we say, to the Greenwich Village, which was uptown from the Bowery. And at the Provincetown Playhouse, there was a lot of hate mail, but they were sold out. And then the producer said, let's move it to Broadway. So now the play kind of fudges the timeline here. The truth of the matter is it wasn't opening night. It ran for 2 or 3 months, with the Vice Squad watching almost every night. The Vice Squad policeman could quote chapter and verse, and I think when I read the transcript, he'd fallen in love with Rivkala, the young girl, and he didn't quite know that it was a play at some point. Really sweet Irish policeman who just sat there night after night suffering because the father was beating his daughter. And he said you could hear her crying in every corner of the room. Anyway, they finally did arrest the cast. And no, it was not the end of God of Vengeance. I do think it was the end of God of Vengeance in a large period of time. It kept it from crossing over into an American repertory. Interestingly enough, playwright was not arrested for obscenity, so we can talk about that a little later, but there it went. And by the way, this was just years before, and this kind of ties the themes together of how we all got involved and what we're doing now. The other playwright who was really suffering arrest and charges of indecency at this point in time was Mae West, who was arrested for her play, The Drag. So it was a very vigilant Vice Squad back then. That's all I can say.
So thank you for that. So then you said to Rebecca, I think it's about more than this trial.
Yes, and I'm really glad she basically said, go with it. And I said, okay, first of all, I think we need a clarinetist, an accordion player, and a violinist. Don't ask me why. She said, okay. Where are we going to find them? I said, I want to write this to music. So I still have the iPod somewhere. I have about 600 songs. I wanted to write the play as it moved forward in time with extant music from the time. So, for example, the play starts with Alla Brida, which was the Bundes song, written in 1895. It's a very rousing little number, and the troupe will dance to it, and then we'll go forward a little bit, and we'll sing another song from the time, and then we'll go forward. And of course, it's going towards By mir bist du schön. And it ends with a song that I listen to every night called Vigila Vigila, which was written by a nurse in the children's ward at Theresienstadt. She wrote it with her guitar, and she went at night and sang this lullaby to the children. And it made me weep every night as I finished writing. The time came that they had the transport train for the children. They were going to take all the children to Auschwitz, and they told Ilse Weber that she did not need to go, and she said, but they'll be terrified. There is a surviving person, a survivor of Auschwitz, who basically said she sang the song as she and the children went into the chamber. So it is an extraordinary song, and it took a while to even find out who would we ask for the rights. There's a book now out on her called Dancing on a Powder Keg. It's quite a woman, and I wanted this to be the kind of Kaddish for the evening, Vigila. So, you know, Rebecca just went, okay, we're gonna find this, we're gonna find a choreographer, and I stalked. Do people here know Lisa Gutkin of the Klezmatics? Have you heard her? She's the lead violinist. I stalked her for about 2 years. She was getting really kind of worried. She'd give a concert, I was there. She'd give another concert across, I was there. And she and another musician, Aron Halva, have created an original score for the dancing and the choreography that's just extraordinary. So that's sort of the 7 years, 5 years on tour with basically the same actors, designers, and stage manager. And we made it as if we were a Yiddish troupe on the road, you know. So it's been the thrill of my life.
Oh, it's beautiful. Such a beautiful show. I want to jump to Yiddish, and then we'll come back to this idea of censorship. Because in addition to this troupe and this sort of love letter you've created to theater and to this, you know, product placement of God of Vengeance, I think one of the big things that Indecent is a Kaddish or a mourning for language that is being lost and culture, as well as the beauty of Yiddish language and culture. And I wanted to start, Miri, I wanted to share your organization, the California Institute for Yiddish Culture and Language. I love this. This is in their mission statement. And it says, encountering Yiddish culture is an opportunity to experience an uncommon joy. And then you also said in an interview, somebody had to see to it that Yiddish survived, and if not me, then who? So I would love to hear a little bit more about the work you're doing with this framework of an uncommon joy and survival. I love the juxtaposition of those two things. If you could share a little with us.
Well, Yiddish was my native language, so it was my mama loshen, if you've heard that term. Yeah. It was really, I guess you could say, it's the only thing that that survived the Holocaust was my parents' language, and they weren't championing Yiddish in any way. It was just their language, and so we spoke it. And I didn't really value it until much later in life. When I was in my 20s, and I actually took a formal course in Yiddish at Columbia because I was a graduate student in environmental planning. And why not? Here's a course in Yiddish, why not? So that's when I discovered that Yiddish has a grammar, and that it's a complicated grammar. And so my respect for it rose, and that was the end of it, really, for another 20 plus years until both my parents had passed away. And then I realized I was losing my language because I had no one to speak it with. So my first encounter really with in my own interest, following my own interest in something to do with Yiddish, happened to be at the Yiddish Book Center. And it was the last program of its kind in the summer. And I was the last person to register. And it changed my life because I learned that not only was it a complicated grammar and all of that stuff, which I already knew, but that it had this extraordinary literature. And this coming from someone whose home was littered with Yiddish books, right, which my mother read. And I had met all these Yiddish writers, but of course you don't understand what it all means until much later in life. So what I experienced in that week was not just my own kind of interest being sparked, but I looked around and there were people of all ages from all over the country, and they were all so happy. They were all so happy to be there and to be engaged with this culture. And everything I did after that, which was going to Oxford to study Yiddish, of all oxymorons, wherever people came together, of all ages, from all over the world, there was this extraordinary joy in experiencing this culture and language and learning more about it every time. And so I felt drawn to it. I just followed my interest. One thing led to another, led to another, led to another. I had no intention of having a career in Yiddish. I don't know what my parents would have thought of this. They would never have encouraged me to have that because they knew it wouldn't lead anywhere, right? But I just followed this bliss, as Joseph Campbell called it, and began to teach, and then created this institute. But it's not just the joy. I have met the most wonderful people through Yiddish, all over the world. I mean, I was blessed to count as my friend, Theodore Bickel, and now Mike Burstein, and Shane Baker, of all people to turn up in my life, an Episcopalian from Missouri. And now Paula Vogel. I mean, really, Yiddish is threatened. It's on the UN list of endangered languages. The number of speakers has, from my parents' generation to now, has dropped by 95%. In spite of the birth rate among Hasidim, it's still not, it's really a huge decline. That's the reality. But we were talking earlier a little bit about the fact that there is a renewed interest and endlessly surprise. Who would imagine that Joel Grey would take an interest in directing Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish? Yes, his father was the great Mickey Katz, but Joel doesn't speak Yiddish, and somehow he got involved and interested, and now you've got Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish on Broadway. Now, who would ever have imagined that, even 2 years ago? I didn't. So you never know. You never know what comes next. Yeah, if enough people are sparked and experience joy, and I know there are some of my former students in here and friends, and I think they can vouch for it as well, right? There's a joy in it. Yes.
Thank you. Will you share how you came to Yiddish? Yes.
I was drinking very heavily at the time.
There you
go. Growing up there in Missouri, we would hear a word here and there as a punchline in a joke. Groucho singing, "Did someone call me schnorrer?" The audience would laugh. I nudged my father. I said, "Daddy, what's a schnorrer?" And being a good Gentile from Kansas City, he gave the only answer he could give. It's a nonsense word. It means nothing.
Right.
He'd be pleased to know I grew up to become one, but I figured out that there's this whole language that we didn't know much about, and then read that it had a distinguished theater that influenced not only American comedy, but the American stage and the world stage. Maybe the most prominent name that you might know is Stella Adler, who taught so many wonderful performers how to act. And she was a bigger hit on the Yiddish stage than she was on the American English stage even. And she was Yiddish theater royalty, as a matter of fact. And so when I got to New York, I said, I'll check out what's this Yiddish theater. I went to see a play. I fell in love with my first Yiddish actress. She was 92, I was 25. That was Mina Bern. I also made friends with Luba Kadison,
You gave a wonderful talk on Nina Byrne today, by the way, at the Fairfax Library.
But you missed it. I made friends with Luba Kadison, who had in fact played the rain scene with Stella Adler in Yiddish, in Morris Schwartz's troupe. And they say in Yiddish, "Als me versucht und sie gut, willst auch noch einmal." If you try it, then it's good, then you want more. Right? And so that's the case for me. It's 25 years later. And
That's beautiful, thank you. And Paula, I would love it if you would share a little bit about how you frame languages in Indecent, because it's such a beautiful part of the show.
Well, so, you know, I feel in many ways sort of this is an American journey of my grandparents spoke Yiddish. And it was kind of like swapping codes when I was with them. Whenever it was getting to the juicy part, suddenly they were speaking Yiddish. And if I did learn certain expressions, my grandmother would say, "You never say that outside this house." But what remains is a yearning, because I have lost the language. I didn't learn the language is lost to me. And that kind of yearning, I think, it fueled Indecent. So the proposition I had, Rebecca Teichmann's grandfather was a Yiddish poet in Montreal. I actually said to her, is there a way that we can construct this play in such a way that everyone will yearn to know Yiddish and that the last scene we understand every word spoken? How do we get to the point where we actually feel like we're native speakers of Yiddish, which remains a great yearning? So I decided, I stole an old trick, which is when the actors, the troupe, when they're in Poland or they're in Berlin, they speak in their native tongue, and they speak perfect English. But when they're in New York or America, they are speaking English with a dialect. And that may sound complicated for the first scene or two, but after a while, you get used to that. And what I did was I consulted, actually Joel Berkowitz did the first translation. I said, I want subtitles where everything is in Yiddish, so that there is a point in the play where the Yiddish goes away and we will feel that yearning. We'll feel that yearning for the lost language. So a lot of help. We had actors who spoke Yiddish coming in and syllable by syllable, teaching the entire troupe every line in the songs, the few Yiddish. It's mostly in English. But I always, I mean, what I really loved is that here these things are on stage and I know what it's supposed to say because I wrote the English. But in New York in particular, everyone who was a Yiddish speaker got to the punchline before the American audience. So you could tell how many people were in the house.
And when you get to see Indecent, the way Paula has crafted it is at the end, you do feel like you are, that you are understanding something in Yiddish, and it's such a remarkable, and it gave me goosebumps to get to have that experience.
Yeah.
Before we open it up for questions from the audience, I want to go back to, yes, please, jump in.
That might be a big part of it, the longing for Yiddish, but we don't necessarily have that longing because we've got it. But for me, when they finally get to the rain scene in that was one of the most emotional moments that I've had in theater, I have to say.
Yeah.
It is one of the most beautiful moments that I've ever seen. It'll stick with me till my longest day. That's incredible. You get to see it a few times and then you see it.
Yes.
And that's, oof. Yeah.
Sholem Asch is an amazing writer. And his novels, the way he wrote about women, and the love that he had for kind of the underclasses that weren't looked at is kind of extraordinary. So that's why I held my breath in the library.
In fact, one other last detail. Yeah. The play is taken from a short story that he wrote called The Pretty Miriam. and it's the second act of the play. And they only put on the first and third acts to make a play for Rudolf Schildkraut.
Right.
So that really was something to him, and what you've done is brought it in the most beautiful way possible to
Thank you.
today's audiences. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'm just checking my time, and okay. In fact, I think it is going to be, I'm going to ask one last question to this panel, and then I'll open it up, because I just want to touch very briefly on going back to the obscenity trial for a moment, this idea of censorship. And you talked about a vice squad, but can you share a little bit, any of you, why the troupe was arrested, where that came from? Because it was censorship from within rather than without, and I think that's an important thing.
Censorship within.
Yeah. Can you share a little bit just of the facts of that, and then any thoughts you have about that?
I mean, you read the whole trial.
Boy, the trial had some great parts to it. Okay, let's think about this for a moment. It's 1922. 1 year hence, the Congress will pass a law that closes the borders to immigration in the United States of America so that we will have no Jewish immigrants. 1923. 1922, Henry T. Ford is writing, publishing a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, that talks about the international conspiracy of Jews. In another 5 years, Father Coughlin will have a talk show and spur on the Know Nothing Party, which talks about taking America back. And it is...
Yeah.
It is the rise of the KKK and white supremacy. There's a lot of reasons to say yes to doing this at this moment in time that Rebecca and I felt. So the truth of the matter is a lot of those, I mean, it was hate mail that they received. There was always the contention that do we show our dirty laundry to the outside world? Yeah. But once it was in Yiddish, when it was traveling in Yiddish, even in Berlin, where I think much of the play could be known, that was an argument that was contained because it was for a Yiddish audience. The second that it was translated, however, people got very, very concerned. And the charges of obscenity were actually spurred by Rabbi Jacob Silverman of Temple Emmanuel. He was an incredibly eminent figure in New York, articulate, passionate, in the head of so many philanthropies helping immigrants that he feared showing this on Broadway to an American Christian audience. He said, this is not needed. And in fact, the argument that broke out on the very first reading in 1906 in Ayel Peretz's living room was exactly that. Burn this. This is going to fuel anti-Semitism. So I think we're in this moment of time, we still are, in a way, when we are going to see theater or artwork. What is our responsibility to our community, and what is our responsibility as artists to treat our community as universal and like every other human being? And I think particularly this is something that I see a lot. I've taught for 40 years. When I get the privilege to work with playwrights who may be, for example, the first Cuban American in their family, recently immigrated, to write in the theater. How do you portray Cuban immigrants in such a way? So, I mean, I think that this is a long-running thing, but it is, I think, an incredible moment for us to think, when do we censor ourselves? Yeah. When is the right time to hold back and make sure that it stays within the community? What is our responsibility as audience members? What is our responsibility as artists? And certainly, thank heavens, we've had very passionate artists continuing to do and work with the God of vengeance. Because otherwise, after that obscenity trial, I think it would have just disappeared.
Yeah.
Well, let's remember, though, that Sholem Asch actually did very well in Europe.
Yes.
You know, his plays were widely translated. And in Europe, they didn't have a problem with the same
Yes.
puritanical
The play talks
ideas.
about that a little
Yeah,
bit. Yeah.
yeah. So,
But there's also an interesting thing about Sholem Asch that, in a way, I like to think about these plays existing to a period where, you know, he was nominated for a Nobel Prize.
yes.
By the time he was 30, he had 6 volumes of his work published.
Incredibly prolific.
Incredibly
author.
prolific. The difficulty, in a way, and what's hanging over that the play doesn't really, it did go into, we cut it out, was the future of Sholem Asch. That Sholem Asch started to write. I actually believe that he did have PTS when he investigated in the 1918, 1920. He was sent abroad by the American Jewish Joint Committee to investigate pogroms. And I think it shattered him. I really, really do. I mean, when you read David's forward to the book on Sholem Asch. So I think there was a moment where, he thought, and I see this with a lot of artists, do I want to be a playwright? Which is having the argument in public. Or do I choose the novel or the poem, where I talk to you individually, each as a reader, right? And I think that allows that kind of more nuanced, complex approach that he had. But the other thing is he started writing books to prove that Christians and Jews had one common root, and that Jesus was a Jew. But he published these at the worst possible time when the community was just devastated by the Holocaust and turned on him as an apostate.
Right.
Abraham Kahan, who had been a great.
Right.
So he actually, yes, he did end up leaving the United States. And in a way, what you're saying about Europe is absolutely interesting and fascinating. Isn't it fascinating that up until, depending on the ghetto you were in, you could perform plays that would be considered obscene on the stages of New York, in the camps and the ghettos where people were bound for the final solution, is an extraordinary kind of an irony. And one thing I just want to say, because one of the reasons I'm glad Rebecca said, yeah, go forward. Let's look at what happens to the play after the 1940s, is that I discovered in Loach that by degrees, first they said to the actors, like our theater troupe, you can no longer perform Chekhov or Shakespeare. You can only perform Jewish writers. Well, they had the plays, so they performed the Jewish writers and the Jewish plays. And then the officials stepped forward and said, we think the most demoralizing thing to the Jewish people will be to forbid theater. So in 1943 in Loach, you could not perform a play in public. You could do dances and skits, you could do cabaret, but you weren't permitted. And just that thought, I mean, I know this sounds strange, but I really kind of hold it to my heart as a legacy. That indeed, this is our legacy in our community in the theater that Yiddish theater has given, that was so strong, and hopefully is still strong with us.
Thank you. So, we have time for some questions from the audience, so I would love to, and is there a mic there is a mic that's coming around, so Kiyomi will come, and let's see.
First, a comment. When I was in high school, I read a lot of his books. I really enjoyed him because I liked he set them in the period of the Pax Romana, which is a time of history that I enjoyed reading. But I also got the impression that he was getting very, very anti-Jewish in some of these writings. Paula, you're teaching Yiddish. Every country, the dialect is so different. Someone will say kickel, someone will say kogel. How do you know which Yiddish to teach?
I think it's directed at me, yes?
Yeah.
Well, there are many dialects. If you're a native speaker, that doesn't faze you at all. However, what happened is somewhere at the turn of the century, Yiddish was standardized. And because it is a phonetic language, and so the way you pronounce it is the way you write it, for the most part, except for those troublesome Hebrew origin words. It's all phonetic. So you had to have a standard spelling, right? And a standard pronunciation. So they used basically the Lithuanian dialect, because only in Lithuania did you speak the Queen's Yiddish. So that became the basis with some variations. And that is what I teach. It's not my native dialect. So when I have a chance to speak my native dialect, it's really very geschmack for me, you know. But I teach Standard Yiddish, which no one was born speaking.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay, you've got the mic right there.
Thank you all very much for such an engaging talk. It was such a pleasure and an honor being in the audience with you. I have a question about the censorship thing. I think in a lot of ways, it seems that we've, I don't know, evolved past sort of the McCarthyist kind of censorship, but at the same time, there seems to be like a growing sense of social control, and particularly with things living or dying based on online presence. And I'd like to hear some of your thoughts about that.
Based on what?
Based on like online reactions.
Oh, today, online reactions.
Social media,
today,
that there's
Yeah.
a censorship going on
Yeah.
because of response on social media.
I don't know a whole lot about that. So, I mean, I don't know if we're past the McCarthy censorship or not. I was talking about Mina Byrne earlier this afternoon, Jigan and Schumacher, the two great Jewish Yiddish comedians, beloved in Europe, Israel, America. During the war, they were on the Soviet side performing, and Stalin had his eye on them, because a totalitarian hates nothing more than a comedian who might poke fun at a fragile ego or speak a truth that they don't want the people to hear. And there are calls for censorship of these things,
Yes.
even today. So I don't know if we're past that. Can always come back.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. The mic is coming to you.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much. I had a question about Israel. I know that Israel has had a very fraught relationship with Yiddish. And in fact, they taxed, I believe, Yiddish performances at one point. And I was wondering what his legacy or the play's legacy were after the founding of the State of Israel.
Yeah, so this came up a little bit today. By the way, I'm a native of Israel, so I also, so I can,
Are you applauding
I
because
can.
she's from there or because she left?
So I have to say that because I love Israel, but I don't like what they did with Yiddish at all, at all. It was unnecessary and helped to kill the language, I have to say, or helped to endanger the language. But this is, actually Shane brought it up a little bit today. There was a period when plays, Yiddish theater was censored, was not just censored, but forbidden in Israel. It was against the law. Can you imagine for Yiddish theater to appear a live performance of Yiddish theater unless you were a traveling troupe coming from somewhere else? This I didn't know. I didn't know that there was this fine distinction. I thought that all Yiddish theater was forbidden. But even just the fact that in a Jewish homeland, Yiddish theater should be forbidden is just beyond comprehension. You know, except of course just the fear that Yiddish being so juicy and so rich a language, when Hebrew was still struggling to you know, find its footing as a natural spoken language, you know, they were afraid of the competition, which makes sense. Today, of course, Hebrew is much richer, thanks to English. Lots of words incorporated in there. I'm sorry, I'm kidding, but it's true. And of course, a wonderful literature in Hebrew. But at that time, it was still kind of nascent. So there was that fear, but still unforgivable.
Wow.
For what it's worth, though, if you're in the Tel Aviv area, in Bat Yam, they just reopened Beit Asch, his home there in Israel.
Yes.
Just reopened, and it's apparently very nice. I've not been, but it's certainly on my list if I go.
Yeah.
Right. But they've only been trying to do that for 20 years.
Yeah, it's, yeah.
It's just a struggle. Yiddish is a struggle.
I mean,
in
there's,
Israel,
by the
sadly.
way, I don't know if people here have read it, but I love the book so much. I read this book called Wonder of Wonders, written by the dramaturg Elisa Solomon, about the adaptation of the short stories of Sholem Asch, and that if it had not have been for the Blacklist and McCarthy, the out-of-work actors would not have gotten together and formed what became the basis for Fiddler on the Roof. So it's really kind of a great read. And in terms of the censorship argument, maybe this is just me, but I tend to think of it coming in waves. And that I believe that there's a benign censorship going on. It's done through funding. If we want to suppress science, we suppress the budget of the NHS. If we want to suppress theater or the National Endowment for the Arts for telling us those little truths, we suppress the budget. So I do tend to think of it as something that's not over, and I have also tracked every place in the United States that has forbidden Angels in America to be performed and refused to teach there.
Oh, wow, good. Good to hear. Thank you. Got a question right here.
Hi. Paula, this question's for you. I had the privilege of seeing Indecent already. And there's a scene in the play that I thought was a turning point or a climate. It's when they've reached already performing in America and they want to change the sleeping scene.
Yes.
And so that part, I also attended a discussion with another playwright a couple years ago, famous playwright. It was at USC, and we were talking about diversity in the theater. This is when, like, films, the Oscar so white and
Right.
Less diversity in film. He had said something shocking to me, that there's actually less diversity in the theater. And I've talked to a couple of professionals, and the few I've talked to agree, actually. I guess that scene in your play and the less diversity in theater, I wanted your thoughts. Because also Sholem Asch, I read that he was hesitant to bring it into America. God of Vengeance, it was popular in Europe. So if you can talk about that.
So you're talking about the discussion of theater being less diverse itself,
yeah.
And it's a shanda. I mean, this is, I think, really, really true. And one of the reasons that I think we're facing is the cost of education. That is, how many universities actually underwrite scholarships and fellowships in the arts? Very, very few. One of the reasons I drink Grey Goose vodka, I'm making this pitch right now, is that the importer of Grey Goose vodka met with the president of Brown University and gave $100 million for minority fellowships. It is a need-blind university. I mean, the difficulty right now is every theater company, every arts institute really has to recruit and figure out how to underwrite. How do you tell someone, listen, you can come and you can work and learn art, to be an art curator. How is that rent being paid? So I do see a lot of this as the leeching of our budgets, but I also see this as a generational thing. And one of the reasons I'm so excited right now, I'm sorry, I'm going to do this, I'm going to cavell. 5 of my playwrights have won 6 Pulitzers. They had their tuition paid, they got a stipend, and they taught 18-year-olds, many of whom became theater artists because Nilo Cruz was teaching them, Chiara Hudiz was teaching them, Ayad Akhtar was teaching them. I was able, because of this one man, to recruit working class students of different ethnicities and races and actually say you can make a living in the theater, which, by the way, you can. But the entry price is very, very steep if we do not do something with paying for education. I mean, we're shutting out generations of students of color. And what you're saying is like, it's something that I got to get off the soapbox right now, but I'm really glad you brought up that question. It's something that we all have to do. There is a time right now that's happening where a number of theater companies are hiring artistic directors of color. And I'm so happy to see so many playwrights and directors of color in the American theater right now. And I hope this keeps growing. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you. And sadly, we are at time. I'm going to end by quoting Paula again, because she said that she felt the God of Vengeance did exactly what plays should do. It provoked people into talking. And I think we could stay here all night and talk and listen, and I wish we could. But will you join me in giving our panelists another round of applause? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
And thank you so much for coming.